To kick off tonight's event, I would like to introduce Professor at the Jepson School, Professor Thad Williamson. He joined us this year from Harvard, where he studied with tonight's main speaker, Dr. Michael Sandel. Thad is a political scientist. He has studied political theory up at Harvard, won the American Political Science Association's Best Dissertation Award for his dissertation on urban sprawl and relating that to theories of justice. So he's a very, very welcome addition to the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and he'll be moderating our session this evening. So Thad, I'll turn it over to you.
Welcome. Just want to give you the game plan. After our main lecture, we'll have two respondents who I'd like to introduce now. Dr. Randi Rashkover, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at York College, Pennsylvania, and our own Dr. Andrea Simpson, who is Professor of Political Science here at the U of R. And after they've had a chance to respond to the lecture, we will have questions, and hopefully lots and lots of good questions. So write them down and say your piece. And we really like to treat this as a true public conversation. It's now my great pleasure and honor to welcome to the Jepson Forum one of the most distinguished and influential political philosophers and public intellectuals in modern American life, Dr. Michael J. Sandel, the Ante and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government at Harvard University. Dr. Sandel earned his doctorate at Oxford University in 1981, and soon after emerged as a major voice in contemporary political theory with the publication of his first book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. That book powerfully argued that dominant liberal theories of justice, as exemplified by the late Harvard philosopher John Rawls, lacked the concept of community sufficiently robust to justify strong norms of democratic social equality. In his subsequent book, Democracy and Its Discontents, Dr. Sandel went yet further and linked the philosophical inadequacies with what he termed procedural liberalism, linked that with Americans' growing disillusionment with the democratic process and the widespread frustration so many of us feel at our inability to hold powerful public and private actors to democratic account. Both of those books have stimulated fruitful and ongoing debates about the connections between the theory and practice of democracy in modern America. I should also say that Dr. Sandel has been equally influential as a teacher. For over 2 decades at Harvard, he has taught a legendary course simply titled Justice, which regularly enrolls 900 or more students each time it is offered. That course has helped spark the moral imagination of literally tens of thousands of students, but it also was a rite of passage and a formative teaching experience for those of us who worked in this small army of teaching assistants leading discussion sections in the course. Before helping with that course, I never would have guessed that it would be possible to combine Hamlet, Homer and Bart Simpson, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and John Stuart Mill all in the same lecture, and have it all make sense. But that course showed the way. Last but not least, Dr. Sandel has also produced dozens of interesting and provocative essays, bringing the resources of moral and political philosophy to bear on a wide range of topics, from abortion to economic inequality to stem cell research. Many of those essays are collected in his newest book, Public Philosophy, Essays on Morality and Politics, which is available, and perhaps you can get an autograph if you'd like after the talk. Tonight, Dr. Sandel will address one of the most enduring and contentious questions in American politics, namely that of the appropriate role of religious and moral convictions in our public discourse. So please welcome Dr. Michael Sandel.
Well, thank you, Thad, for those overly generous words of welcome and introduction. Indeed, Lucio, thank you so much for the warm welcome that you and the faculty and the students I've met today have given me to the University University of Richmond into the Jepson School. And I know that there are lots of different conceptions people have of leadership and how to teach it. And is it even possible to teach leadership? And I think that the vision of the Jepson School and Dean Ruscio to conceive leadership broadly and is bound up not just with techniques of management, but also with values, is exactly the right way to think about leadership in a democratic society and educating young men and women as leaders. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I admire very much what you're doing. Thank you for that. My subject, my assignment for tonight is to try to answer a simple question. What role should morality and religion have in American public debate? Now, there is a short answer to that question that many of us may find ourselves tempted by. As little as possible should be the role of religion and morality in politics. Now, the reason that's a tempting answer, well, look around us. Look at the invocations of morality and religion, the claims of faith that are often made in the public arena. A lot of them are pretty troubling. They're troubling especially those of us who are committed to ideals of pluralism and diversity and mutual respect in a society where people disagree. We know that people disagree profoundly on moral and religious questions. So the impulse is to say, let's not go there. That's dangerous terrain. And what are the issues that come to mind when you think about religion and politics? Probably the issues that come to mind are ones that run pretty close to risking coercion and intolerance. So what do we think of when we think of religion and politics? Banning abortion, prohibiting same-sex marriage, restricting stem cell research, inserting or imposing creationism or intelligent design, or polite term for it, in the public schools, displaying the Ten Commandments in the courthouse, or even campaigning to insist that department stores restore Merry Christmas greetings on their shopping bags, rather than that bland, allegedly politically correct, perniciously ecumenical phrase, Happy Holidays. And then, it's not only in the public policy arena that we hear more and more about religion and faith in public discourse. We even see a kind of revival of a certain kind of theological, metaphysical explanation for natural disasters. Have you noticed that? Lately, there was most recently Pat Robertson talking about the stroke suffered by the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, saying this was divine retribution for giving back Gaza to the Palestinians. That was Pat Robertson a few weeks ago. And then there was the mayor of New Orleans who said that God has sent, he was talking about the aftermath of Katrina in New Orleans. Did you see what he said? That God has sent hurricane after hurricane after hurricane to the Gulf Coast because God is mad at America. He's God in America, mad at America. God is, because he doesn't approve of us being in Iraq under false pretenses. And he is also, the good mayor said, he's also angry at Black America because we're not taking care of ourselves, of our women, and of our children. So divine retribution, Pat Robertson and Mayor Nagin in New Orleans, and then there was, of course, Jerry Falwell in the aftermath of September 11th. You remember what he had to say about that event? that this was divine retribution for paganism, abortion, feminism, gay rights, and the American Civil Liberties Union. So it's no wonder when we hear this use of religion in public discourse that we're inclined to flee from it, to say our public life would be much better off without it. Get rid of it. What I'd like to suggest is just the opposite. The cure for intolerant expressions of religion and faith in public discourse is not to empty the public square of moral and religious discourse, but rather to enlarge, to enrich, to engage, and openly to debate the moral and religious and spiritual dimensions of public life. That's what I'm going to try to persuade you of. And then, in the discussion, you'll tell me why this is dangerous or mad or worse, this idea. There are two reasons I think we shouldn't try to banish moral and religious argument from political discourse. The first reason is that on a great many issues that we do need to debate and decide democratically, it isn't possible truly to be neutral on substantive moral and religious claims. The second reason is, even where it is possible to be neutral on moral and religious questions, it may not be desirable. Now let me first give you a couple of examples in the first category, where try as we might, it really isn't possible to decide the question without engaging with, arguing through, and deciding about the substantive moral and religious question at stake. What's the most famous or infamous moral question in contemporary politics? Well, as anyone who's been watching the Alito hearings knows, it's the abortion debate. Now, whatever one thinks about Roe versus Wade, whether the courts should have decided this, whether it was wise, whether it should have been left to the states to resolve, whether the right really is in the Constitution or isn't in the Constitution. Take the fundamental moral question at stake in the abortion debate. There are those who favor permitting abortion, those in the pro-choice camp, often say the reason we're pro-choice, the reason we shouldn't legislate against abortion, is that we want government to be neutral on moral and religious questions, and when states try to legislate to restrict abortion, they are drawing on a certain conception and imposing a certain view about the moral status of the fetus. In fact, in Roe versus Wade, Justice Harry Blackmun's famous opinion, one that they're still debating in these hearings, about which Judge Alito professes an open mind, that opinion, Justice Blackmun heard what I think discredited the opinion. It starts out by saying, Texas, it was a Texas law that was struck down. Texas can't impose on all its citizens a certain moral or religious view about when human life begins. That's how Blackmun began his reasoning. But then what did he do? What did the court do? What does anyone have to do who takes a position on the abortion question? He, on behalf of the court, substituted a different answer to that question. They didn't bracket or set aside that question. Because think about it. If the view of the pro-life camp and of the Catholic Church's official position is true, if human life, in the relevant moral sense, does begin at conception, then the fetus is morally equivalent to a person, and to permit abortion is to sanction the killing of a human person for the sake of other good and important values. But that is what it is.
So anyone who wants to take a position on either side of the abortion debate has to decide, can't be neutral on what is the moral status of the fetus. A related example is the debate about stem cell research. Now, it's true, it's a little different from the abortion debate because it doesn't involve the fetus. Stem cell research, for those of you who have been following the arcana of this debate, and it gets pretty arcane, boils down to this. Stem cell research holds great promise for curing many degenerative diseases, like Parkinson's and diabetes, spinal cord injury, because the early embryo, or blastocyst, is just a cluster of cells without human form, just after egg and sperm come together. Stem cells can be extracted at that stage and can, so scientists think, grow to become any type of organ in the body. That's the medical promise. That's what scientists and medical people are so excited about. And so many people say, look, there are some religious opponents to embryonic stem cell research, but look at the great medical benefit. Surely they should impose their religious view to prevent other people from reaping this benefit. That would be a persuasive argument, but only if it draws in a further assumption, usually unargued, that blastocyst, that virtually microscopic early embryo, is not the same as a human person. If it is, if the Catholic Church position is right, that it is a human person, then, notwithstanding the great medical promise, most of us would probably not favor permitting embryonic stem cell research, because it would be as if we came up with a great cure through organ transplantation and said, well, it's like the classic case in Ethics 101. Suppose you could save the life of 6 people who were about to die for want of an organ if you yanked the organs out of some healthy child. 6 of them. One would die, but 6 would live. We wouldn't make that calculus. We wouldn't sanction it. But that, if you actually follow through the argument, that is what we would be doing if it were true that blastocyst, that early cluster of cells, were morally equivalent to a person. So we have to decide that question. And I'm suggesting better that we acknowledge that and try to argue through and reason our way through the question, what is the moral status of this blastocyst used in embryonic stem cell research? Rather than pretend, no, we're just forging ahead for the sake of medical progress, and we're not imposing any religious view one way or the other on that hard moral question. Third example. Now here I've taken already hotly contested issues. Here's one more. We can't shy away from it. Same-sex marriage. Now what about that? Opponents of same-sex marriage, what's their objection? For the most part, it's an objection that draws very often on a certain moral and often religious conception about the proper ends or purposes of marriage. And the idea is that marriage is essentially bound up with procreation. And since same-sex couples can't procreate, at least not naturally with one another, their union doesn't realize the purpose that marriage as an institution is meant to honor and promote and prize. That's a traditional religious objection. Now, what about the argument of neutral toleration? We're not going to decide one way or the other among moral or theological views about the purpose of marriage. We're simply going to say, keep morality and religion out of it. Let's simply let people make their decisions for themselves. If heterosexual couples want to marry, that's their right. If same-sex couples want to marry, that's their right. They're not harming anyone else. End of argument. A simple, neutral principle of non-discrimination, of equal treatment under the law. Why do we have to delve in? Now, so this is a Harvard case. This is a Harvard case to see how it's impossible, as I'm claiming it is, to avoid the underlying moral/theological question, because it seems there is a simple principle, neutral principle of non-discrimination that can get you there. But it can't. If you really held consistently to the principle that government and law should be neutral on moral and religious questions with respect to marriage, what would the position be? It wouldn't be, as it is now in the state from which I come, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There, the Supreme Court has required that marriage be extended to same-sex couples. Instead, there's a third position, third possibility. Why not, if you really want to be neutral, why not get the state out of the business of conferring recognition on marital arrangements altogether? A version of this solution was proposed by Michael Kinsley in a column he wrote about a year ago when he argued for the abolition of marriage, by which he didn't mean that people couldn't get married. He meant the abolition of state-recognized, licensed marriage. He said, let people get married. This is the pure libertarian neutral position. Let people form whatever living arrangements they want to, with whatever partners they want to. Don't put the state in the position of picking and choosing which ones will be sanctified or recognized or honored under law. Provide protection for children. Provide for beneficiaries on life insurance policies, hospital visitation, privileges, and so on. And let whatever institutions in society, in private institutions, within civil society, confer whatever marriages they want to. So it would be up to churches and synagogues and mosques to set their rules. They might permit same-sex marriage. They might restrict marriage only to heterosexual couples. They might permit polygamous unions. They might restrict it to two partners. That should be up to the churches. And not only churches. Some people might not want to get married in a church or a synagogue. Let other institutions, Kinsley says, let casinos and department stores get into the act if they want to. And if people want their marriage blessed in a casino, that's up to them. So there is a neutral position, but it's not one that's favored by either side in the debate, today's debate over same-sex marriage. Why not? Because it isn't just a matter of living and letting live, of freely choosing one's own partner or partners. What's at stake in the same-sex marriage debate is what forms of union, intimacy, partnership will enjoy the recognition and the honor that goes with public conferral or approval. And that's why there is this debate. So how would the debate proceed if you don't want this purely neutral solution? You have to take on the question, what is the purpose of the social institution of marriage? Is it true that procreation is the only purpose, the ultimate telos, as Aristotle would have put it, the proper end of marriage? Is that theory right? Or, as others argue, who engage in the substantive moral argument, Or is marriage also for the sake of honoring, encouraging, and recognizing lifelong commitments between partners that express love and mutual responsibility? So there are two different accounts of what the purpose of marriage is properly understood. And any society that's going to have an institution of marriage short of this supermarket, department store, purely privatized model has to sort out in public discourse what the purpose of marriage is and can't resolve the same-sex marriage debate short of that. Now, so here are three examples of how it's sometimes not possible, even though we try to separate the question of law from substantive arguments about morality and religion. What about those cases where it may be possible, but where, so I am suggesting, it's not desirable to try to detach politics and law from substantive moral and religious claims? Why not desirable? Well, one answer to this question is look historically at some of the great movements of moral and political progress in the United States. You know, today it's very easy, given the litany of questions with which I began, easy to think that those who want to bring religion into politics are conservatives, Christian conservatives or others to the right who want to ban all sorts of things. And it is true that in recent decades, conservatives, more than liberals, have brought religious and moral arguments explicitly to bear in the public arena. But it hasn't always been that way. And there's nothing inherently conservative about the idea of engaging the moral and religious dimensions of politics and law. We only have to think back to the civil rights movement to remember a time when the religious and spiritual and moral dimensions of public discourse were very much voiced on the left. Martin Luther King and the advocates of the civil rights movement. A letter from Birmingham jail, that was addressed to fellow ministers. And Martin Luther King often and freely drew on the Christian sources of the moral and political arguments that he was advancing. Think back into the 19th century, the abolitionist movement in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. Many of the abolitionists argued against slavery on the grounds that slavery is a sin. And the Christian evangelicals were a very important part of the abolitionist movement. Now, if you believe as a matter of principle in liberal neutrality, keeping moral and religious arguments at a distance, what about the abolitionists? Were they wrong? Were they consorting with the risk of coercion and intolerance to bring moral and religious arguments to bear? So, it's not, conservatives don't have in principle a monopoly in this way of arguing. In fact, it's interesting. When Martin Luther King was invoking Christian themes in the civil rights movement, there were those who said, there was one opponent of civil rights who made the argument that Martin Luther King is wrong to bring religion into politics. The role of the preacher is to save souls, not to try to change the policy of the government. You know who said that? A man named Jerry Falwell. That was his critique of Martin Luther King. Now, Falwell came to change his mind just in time for Ronald Reagan's presidency around 1980, the moral majority. What I'm suggesting is that Jerry Falwell was right when he changed his mind, not in the content accepting the idea that he had once rejected when he was criticizing Martin Luther King. Now, that leaves us with the question, how might this work today? You might be thinking, well, it's all well and good to try to remember some historical cases when religion played a progressive, enlightened role on behalf of moral and political improvement, and today it seems narrow and intolerant and potentially coercive. What would a revival of moral and religious discourse in our politics look like that might inform a progressive, pluralist, democratic politics, not a narrow, intolerant, fundamentalist? What issues would it raise? Well, there are a number of issues. Consider the gap between rich and poor. Consider the increasing tendency of markets and market-oriented thinking to reach into spheres of life that traditionally have been governed by other values, whether commercials in the public schools, or the advent of for-profit hospitals, for-profit prisons, for-profit schools. Those are a couple of areas. Let me offer a small illustration of how a revived attention to moral and religious, and also how moral and religious argument could actually strengthen the civic project. Take a small example, state lotteries. Now, there's been a kind of unrecognized revolution in the finances and the revenue-raising policies of state government over the last 20 years, and that's the rise of state lotteries. 30 years ago, there were, I think, only 1 or 2 states that had state lotteries. Today, 40 do. And it's very appealing because it seems in a time when no politician wants to go to the electorate to ask for increased taxes, it seems like a painless way to raise revenue. No one has to buy a lottery ticket, and yet state lotteries raise huge funds, now a huge revenue source for state and local governments. There are at least 2 objections that some people have to state lotteries. And what's interesting is that they come from very different places on the political spectrum. From the left comes the criticism, and it's a fair one, that state lotteries, though they are voluntary, strictly speaking, amount to the most regressive tax system we have, because the people who play lotteries disproportionately are from the lower working class and from the poor. And that's not an accident. State lottery commissions know this, and they direct their advertising to poor neighborhoods. In Chicago, there was a large billboard advertising the Illinois State Lottery showing a lottery ticket, and the slogan, "This could be your ticket out." Out of the ghetto. Now, so it's a regressive tax. It's also, as that the image of that billboard suggests, it puts the state in the position of engaging in a kind of perverse or corrupt civic education. Because the state is spending its legitimacy, its authority, to promulgate a certain kind of moral teaching that says, in effect, the world of work, well, that lands you in the difficulties in which you find yourself. But if you buy a ticket, and if you win, through no work of your own, but through good luck, you may escape from the veil of tears associated with the world of work. Now, what about the idea that the state or government or the public realm should be promoting, not degrading, important civic goods and civic values having to do with work and contribution and mutual sacrifice and the rewards that attach to it, rather than the opposite. So it's a regressive tax, it's a perverse kind of civic education. education. And here's the argument from the right. There are many Christian conservatives who don't like state lotteries because they regard gambling as a sin. Now, here would be a very interesting experiment to see whether politically it would be possible to have some dialogue and some coalition among these two different groups to at least raise the question. This is a question for further debate, whether raising revenues through state lotteries increasingly is a good way or a bad way to achieve a good society. But you can't even imagine having that debate without recognizing and appealing to and developing and working out the resonance of these different moral and partly religious views about the role of the lottery. That's a small example. Let me mention a couple of broader themes that might be suggestive, at least, for the shape of a politics that would enrich and enlarge and engage moral and religious discourse in politics rather than try to restrict it. One theme is the theme of solidarity, which has roots in religious traditions, but is perfectly intelligible and available in secular traditions as well. Think back to the debate we had a year ago over Social Security. The Bush administration wanted to privatize part of Social Security with what were euphemistically called personal accounts. Now, to some extent, there was a confusion, a studied confusion perhaps, between the question of personal accounts and making the system more solvent, and it turned out one had nothing really to do with the other. But what was at stake in the debate about whether to privatize part of Social Security? Framed in one way, it was just a debate about how to get a better return on the savings you set aside for your retirement. That was the argument of the Bush administration. But what was really happening more beneath the surface than in explicit public debate were two rival pictures about the moral principles underlying Social Security. The objection to the privatization of the personal accounts was not that the actuarial statistics will be wrong and that people wouldn't actually make more that way. Younger workers saving as if in a 401k. What's at stake, what was at stake, but not articulated explicitly, was the fact that Social Security actually operates, but we don't often describe it this way, as an expression of a certain kind of intergenerational solidarity. It isn't just that when we have payroll taxes withheld from our checks, we're putting it away to save for our retirement. Not really. It's that here's a form of taxation on those who are working that will go to support a decent retirement for those who are no longer working or who are the survivors of someone who has died, a worker who has died in the family. And there is some element of redistribution. So the underlying ethic is one of solidarity, but it's been masked. And it was masked going all the way back to FDR, who invented it. It's interesting, if you look back at the rationale for Social Security in 1935, FDR didn't say here's an instrument of social solidarity through which we can express the mutual obligation of citizens to one another. No. He said this is really like, it's social insurance. It's a way of the government mandating a kind of retirement plan for everyone. And he knew that. And he said, that's why we'll fund it through payroll tax deductions. We'll call them payroll contributions. Because that will make it look like a private insurance scheme. He said, I know that's bad economics. But with those payroll taxes in there, he said, no damn politician will ever be able to get rid my Social Security system. So he made a pact with the individualist, market-oriented mentality of the American political tradition as he saw it, to devise a retirement system not unlike those of the welfare states of Europe, but without explicitly invoking the ideal of solidarity that actually is expressed in the system. And so when George Bush came along, he almost was able to kind of drive a wedge through the hole that FDR had left in the rationale for Social Security, but we didn't succeed. So solidarity is one thing. Let me mention one other. The idea of shared sacrifice, which is closely connected with solidarity. There's been a lot of debate about the Iraq War, but I think one of the missed opportunities of the Democratic Party, put aside the question of whether the war was right or wrong, effective or ineffective. One of the missed opportunities is that whatever one thinks of the war and the legitimacy of the end and its effectiveness, it's a war whose effect and burden has been cabined, sequestered on a paid military drawn for the most part from the lower middle class. And shortly after 9/11, there was a welling up of the desire, a sense of national community, and a desire for shared sacrifice. What can we do, people asked. And reporters asked President Bush, are you asking the American public to sacrifice and in this war against terror? And his answer was, well, they are sacrificing. They're standing longer in lines at the airport. That was his answer. And then he was asked in an interview on D-Day at Normandy by Tom Brokaw, same question. This is after the war in Iraq was already carrying on. Tom Brokaw, who's written about the greatest generation and the sacrifice involved on the home front during World War II, he put to the president the question again about where's the shared sacrifice by the American public as a whole? And President Sancho was, I'm not sure I know what you mean. And so Brokaw then gave some examples from World War II. And all the president could say was, well, the economy hasn't been as good as it should be, so naturally people are sacrificing, but the economy is getting better. That was his answer. Now, the Democrats didn't seize on that. And how might they have seized on it? They might have asked about cutting taxes, especially falling disproportionately on the wealthiest members of society during a time of war. They might have asked about an energy tax, which would be an instrument of shared sacrifice at home, that would, in some pale way at least, express a certain solidarity with the sacrifices taking place by young men and women in Iraq. And at the furthest, in its fullest expression, there might have been a debate about whether about the whole system of an all-volunteer army versus an army of conscription during times of war. Charles Rangel raised that question, but it never really came to be a debate. So, solidarity, shared sacrifice, these are two themes whose application are open to argument, but they suggest at least the possibility of a kind of moral and religious and civic discourse that isn't necessarily the province and the monopoly of those to the right of the political spectrum. So here in short is my argument. The solution, the cure for for the narrow, intolerant voices of faith and of religion and of morality and politics is not to flee, but rather to engage. Partly because many of these questions really can't be answered in a way that's neutral with respect to the underlying moral question. And also because if everyone in the political debate doesn't participate in a vibrant, vigorous, engaged argument over hard moral and sometimes religious questions, the result will not be a neutral, equal public arena. It will be what some have called a naked public square with a moral void that will be filled. And it will be filled by narrow, intolerant moralisms rather than by a rich array, a cacophony of moral and religious arguments, contention, disagreement, but about the substance. Fundamentalists will rush in where liberals fear to tread. And so for that reason, I think the better course and the safer course for a democratic society is to invigorate moral and religious argument in politics rather than to banish it or to flee it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Sandel. We will first hear from Randi Rashkover. Take it away.
Good evening, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm honored to respond to Professor Sandel. And I'd like to thank Pat in particular for sending the invitation to me. It's really a terrific honor. Tonight, I want to locate my particular responses to Professor Sandel from the context of being a theologian. That's the dominant sphere of my work. The most interesting thing to note about Professor Sandel's work from a theological perspective is the extent to which Professor Sandel and a number of political thinkers these days are extending an interesting invitation to religious believers to begin to more clearly and explicitly articulate their own religious justifications as the basis for their political positions. That's a unique invitation, and it's one that is relatively new within the scheme of liberal politics, particularly as it's introduced by Lockean thought. The question that it may be counterintuitive to those of you who understand yourself as secularists, but from a theologian's perspective, the theologian has to actually first ask herself, she has to tread cautiously with this kind of invitation. She has to actually think to herself, how do I want to respond to this invitation? I think secularists often think that religionists are really quick to jump at the Constantinian possibility of kind of grabbing the political coattails and just running wild with it. But theologians are of more liberal stripes have been more reticent to do that. So we have to first ask, is this a good thing for believers? And second of all, if we do determine that it's a good thing for believers, what is the actual application, or what form would an increased role for religious justifications in the political sector actually look like? What would that role look like? I don't have a lot of time, so I can't really speak to, I can't really diagram or profile for you why it is that more liberal-minded religious believers might see the invitation as a good thing. Suffice it to say, though, that within the modern Jewish liberal tradition, even the most liberal of Jewish thinkers who were most interested in showing their alliance to the rise of secular politics, even the most liberal of them actually advocated a very close relationship between religion and politics, and in particular between Judaism and politics. Hermann Cohen, Moses Mendelssohn, et cetera, et cetera. In the 20th century, of course, some of the really great theologians began to, again, reconsider a post-Constantinian alliance between religion and politics. Thinkers like Franz Rosenzweig and Karl Barth, thinkers whose alliance between religion and politics was really within the but nonetheless compelled by their understanding of the response to a word of God, which required that they take their religious lives out of the privatized sphere and enunciate their claims in the public sector. So we can sufficiently agree that religious believers of non-Constantinian stripes have good reason to want to use their religious positions as justification in the political sphere. The question that we then have to ask is, what form should that application actually take? Now, I think the first and most important thing that believers would want who come from this perspective is a shift in the rhetoric around tolerance. Believers, as above mentioned, ought to be pleased with the trends in desecularization. If desecularization means that they can use the language of their convictions as the basis of their positions, granted, and I think secularists should be happy to hear this, believers should be expected to present their accounts of the good within the terms of rationality consistent with their own traditions. And believers have to be prepared to actually communicate the premises of their own rationality to worldviews that have different standards of rationality. But that move of translation is a far cry from a kind of Lockean understanding that every single time a religious believer wants to express a political point of view, she has to leave her religious articulation at the door, and she has to use a secular language of politics or foreign policy to express a political point of view. So what we really need is we need a shift in the language of tolerance. We need the rhetoric of tolerance to permit religious believers to have recourse to their thick descriptions or their own self-understandings. And I think it's on this particular point that Professor Sandel and I are in closest agreement. And there are a number of cases, and time doesn't permit me to cite Professor Sandel's appreciation for the need to really expand liberalism's understanding of the concept of religious tolerance to include what we would call the thick descriptions of the encumbered selves. But Sandel's comments on the relation between religion and politics actually extend further than a deeper understanding of tolerance. In a number of places, and I think we've heard elements of this tonight, Sandel links his commitment to the sense of tolerance to his hopes to revitalize what in certain places he calls civic republicanism. His hopes for civic republicanism are quite well known, and he echoed some of them tonight. Sandel is not unaware of some of the problems with civic republicanism. He understands that civic republicanism of a certain old sort presupposes a common language of civic virtue that's not really available to us any longer. And therefore he understands that civic republicanism may actually, these days, produce clamor, discord, and may be harder to actually articulate what a civic republicanism is. And also, Sandel in certain places suggests that civic republicanism, some people might say, is not actually desirable. It may not be desirable because it may actually invite certain other problems. Okay, so, but pragmatically speaking, Sandel ultimately argues that when it comes to the question of whether or not civic republicanism is going to breed clamor and discord, or it's going to result in unbridled majoritarianism, he generally responds, as he similarly did tonight, in a pragmatic vein, and says we really don't have a choice. The effort to ignore the overriding goods and narratives of individual communities is ontologically charged Rawlsianism is just too naive. Overcoming charges that republicanism is coercive, Professor Sandel argues that republicanism differs from bold-faced communitarianism because it understands a pluralistic conversation about goods is not a shouting match with the loudest voice is the winner. There are criteria for what counts as a reasonable position in what other philosophers have called moral dialogues, and following these rules guard against majoritarianism. However, I'd like to argue that Sandel's response to the question of coercion overlooks an important way in which civic republicanism can actually itself be coercive. As Michael Walzer phrases it, Sandel's communitarianism comes in two forms. First, civic republicanism, and the second, a kind of pluralism. What Sandel, according to Walzer, doesn't see is that there's a tension between the two versions. And it's precisely this tension that impacts on Sandel's ability to present a view of democracy that believers are going to buy into hook, line, and sinker. Okay? While, like Walzer, I see a tension between Sandel's civic republicanism and his pluralism, my concern is with the extent to which this tension is applied to religious believers' ability to authentically participate in democracy without compromising their primary obligation to their first covenantal community. More specifically, Sandel's vision of a postmodern civic republicanism, and I think we've heard some elements of this tonight, runs the risk of instrumentalizing religion as a vital source of for moral discourse in the name of strengthening the democratic community. In Democracy's Discontents, Professor Sandel says, quote, "What makes a religious belief worthy of respect is not its mode of acquisition, but its place in a good life, or from a political point of view, its tendency to promote the habits and dispositions that make good citizens." The above stated tension between civic republicanism and pluralism is here illustrated and applied to religion. Of course, the irony of Sandel's view is that authentic repair of civic republicanism requires the cultivation of civic virtues as funded by the moral vitality of local communities. Religious communities, particularly Orthodox ones, are really well suited to be funds for this kind of moral discourse. However, it's precisely these groups that are particularly well equipped with moral vocabularies that are going to actually be quite skeptical about lending their moral vocabularies to an understanding of the larger community, seeing the larger community as the fundamental, most significant arena of their obligations. Sandel tends to vacillate back and forth between what we might call a strong and a weak version of civic republicanism. For example, if by republicanism you mean that, quote, as you say in a particular text, local attachments can serve government by engaging citizens in a common life beyond their private pursuits, by cultivating a habit of attending to public things, then it's easier to negotiate between an orthodox religious commitment and one's service to the democratic community. Believers' commitment to public change models a behavior that others can cultivate in terms of their own narratives. The civic republican that emerges here is a de facto byproduct of individuals' communities' unique commitment to their world. Elsewhere, however, though, Professor Sandel stands by a stronger form of civic republicanism. And I think one of the good places to see an example of this is in an essay that Professor Sandel wrote about Dewey in the book on public philosophy that's over there. In that article, Professor Sandel provides a very careful reading of Dewey's work in contrast to Richard Rorty's reading. And he rightly appreciates that Dewey is much more than the pragmatist that Rorty generally thinks that he is. Interestingly enough, though, I think that there's an extent to which, in your analysis of Dewey's work, you're not critical enough of Dewey. And what you see in Dewey's work is Dewey's basic model was the notion of a common faith, the Great Society. And for Dewey, the Great Society is really the nexus between moral values, metaphysical values, but the Great Society can be the arena where we can actually negotiate all of those values, if you will, for this highest good, the Great Society being the highest good. Dewey himself can say, till the Great Society is converted into a great community, the public will remain in eclipse. What distinguishes the great community from the Great Society is not simply that the great community is morally and not just legally functional, but rather that the great community constitutes our best hope for the fulfillment of our needs. That's the Deweyan perspective. While Sandel admits the gulf between Dewey's focus on the nation as the Great Society and our less nationally focused view, Sandel does not dismiss the Deweyan hope for the great community. A community that, in Sandel's terms, judges the worth of its subsidiary communities on the grounds of their contribution to the common good. Like Sandel, Jews have long distinguished between a legal community and a moral community. Generally speaking, traditional Jews recognize the covenantal community as their great community, and contrast this with other political and social contexts that they may be a member of at any given point in time. This is not to say that Jews, for example, are averse to living in democracies. It is to say, however, that they will be averse to a democracy that attempts to substitute for their own moral community or eschatological hope for a redeemed community. In summary, Sandel's embrace of religion's role in public operations of democracy is a welcome advance over anachronistic notions of tolerance. Sandel, however, should understand that while believers have good reasons to argue in favor of a tolerance based in thick description of their identities, they may be more skeptical about a vision of civic republicanism that challenges the prioritization of their covenantal community. To the extent that civic republicanism judges religious communities in terms of their value for the great community, believers may opt for some hybrid account of democracy rooted in an expanded view of rights theory applied to incumbent civils.
Thank you. And let's hear from Professor Simpson.
Good evening. I'm really happy to be here, and I just wanted to pass Williamson's horn while I'm up here. As a member of the Executive Council of the American Political Science Association, I've got to tell you, we have about 15,000 members worldwide, so can you imagine the competition for a dissertation fellowship, an award from our organization. So he is an exceptional scholar, and I'm really happy that he's here at the University of Richmond. surrogacy, stem cell research. There are all kinds of questions that I think we're going to have difficulty answering on the basis of the Constitution and how we'll go about doing that. I also think that there is a search for meaning on the part of most American citizens, and you see it manifested in popular culture almost everywhere. I don't know if everybody's noticed the proliferation of television sitcoms about mediums and people who communicate with the dead and people who have special relationships with God. And we've got a new show on about a priest who was talking to Jesus in his car. And so I think that there's something going on out there, and a part of it is that we are in somewhat of a quagmire on a variety of issues. But in reading Professor Sandel's work and listening to him tonight, and I also have to give you the scoop on me. I'm a political scientist. I do U.S. politics. I do race, class, gender, social movements under that. I'm not a political theorist, but I do play one on Jepson panels. So I just wanted to say that so you know where I'm coming from. First of all, I want to talk about what I feel is left out sometimes in Professor Sandel's work, and that's the centrality of race, and that's what I do, and some of these dilemmas. He brings up Ray Nagin and Katrina, and we had lots of discussions on campus and in class about the racial elements and aspects of Katrina. And I want to say about the quote that he used. I don't know if you've heard Ray Nagin's reply to the criticism that he received all over the country, but he said he'll take back the part about God. He regrets that he said anything about God. He says, but he won't take back his term chocolate city. That's what he won't take back. When interviewed citizens, they said that chocolate city remark, I think he went over the top with that one. And his reply was, I've used it over and over again, and nobody said anything. And I'm not taking it back, but I should have left God out of my comments. So I thought that was an interesting response to his speech on Martin Luther King Day. Which, by the way, I don't know if anybody noticed this last Monday, everybody seemed to go a little wacky. Hillary Clinton went a little wacky, everybody went a little wacky on Martin Luther King Day. But the other thing I want to talk about is he talks about Roe v. Wade, and as we know, all of the questioning of the Supreme Court justices have centered around what they think about Roe v. Wade and the right to privacy. Professor Sandel has written brilliantly on this subject. But one of the things that I think that he hasn't touched on that I'd like to touch on is that, and I say this in my class to get a laugh out of the students, and some laugh and some don't. But I say, we love fetuses, it's the kids we hate. So I want us to also have a debate about what are we going to do with these children after they're born, and our tremendous neglect of poor and minority children. And just this last week, a young girl was killed by her father and stepfather in New York because she stole a container of yogurt out of the family refrigerator. So these kinds of issues I wish we also address. And then same thing about same-sex marriages. I think that part of the problem too is we really need to be honest in our discussions about these issues. That it's not only religious and moral concerns that we have, but I think we're a little bit obsessed with the sexual habits of same-sex couples, and we don't really want to talk about that. But I also have another little joke that I say to my students, some laugh and some don't, and that is that I know heterosexuals with repulsive sexual habits. I have a girlfriend who I won't eat dinner with. So, and I tell her, you know why. I think that I'd like for us to talk about this too. Yes, I got my job because I'm a stand-up on my side. So I think we also have really strict, narrow notions of family, and African Americans have run into this problem, right, with the state. And the state's wanting to provide for different configurations of family. Does a family have to have a man? In most African American families, in fact, 48% of African American families, there is no man present. So there may be aunts, grandmothers, those kinds of things, and I think we also need to discuss that. And if we think that the family is a basic organizing unit of society, and have to be one of those people individually believes that family is a good organizing unit for community and for governance and for democracy, I will also concede that there are those who have serious religious and moral opposition to these things. Finally, I want to say Professor Sandel does characterize Martin Luther King as leftist. As a person who worked at the King Papers Project at Emory University for 4 years as a grad student, I've got to say that I think he's a centrist. And while it is true that in his letter from a Birmingham jail, his references to God's law as the equivalent of just law is a powerful argument. And there's no question about it. He used a lot of religious metaphors, but his real argument was firmly rooted in constitutional law. And I just want to make that clear. I mean, he seemed left at the time, but I think as we get further down the road, he seems more and more centrist. Probably by the time I'm dead and gone, he'll be on the right. Right-wing Martin Luther King. But in his last speech, in Memphis, which is my hometown, I'll confess that too. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. I was at the last march with King. I'm ideologically biased. One of the dirty 30 at the University of Richmond, probably, if we had such a list. They have a dirty 30 list at UCLA, for those of you who don't know, the 30 most liberal left-wing professors. Okay, students that I see back there of mine, don't get any ideas. Okay, I'm just joking. But he said, somewhere I read about the freedom of assembly, because he's responding to an injunction against the following day's march, which he won't make because he will be assassinated. But he said, somewhere I read about the freedom of assembly, somewhere I read about the freedom of expression. We have the right to protest for rights. So he was mostly rooting himself in constitutional law, which in my view makes him very much a centrist in political terms. And that's why I kind of believe that there's a possible solution to our problem. And there's a way sometimes we can hold on to both our faith and our obligations as citizens. And sometimes I tell my students, when talking about same-sex marriage, is it possible, and I'm not sure it is, Professor Sandel, that we can have our faith, but we can also put on a citizen's hat and say, I think one thing as an individual, but what do I want to do as a citizen? What would be for the greater good, and how much faith do I have in the United States and the Constitution? We have great faith in that. The state lottery, I want to make a comment on that. Well, having the poor buy lottery takes it a lot easier than providing equal education and low-income housing. So about that. I also want to say something a little bit about self-sacrifice, and again, this is a gap in Professor Sandel's work that I want to address. Although I enjoyed reading his work very much, I advise everybody to get it. He's a beautiful writer and gives us lots and lots to think about. But my mom told me often about World War II and how much aluminum she turned in, and her saving sugar, and her only baking cakes once every 2 weeks because it was a sugar ration. She was very proud of all the things that she did to further the cause of World War II. And I will end by saying, all while sitting on the back of the bus. So I just want to make that point, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Just in case anybody disagrees with anything that's said by anybody, or there's any need for clarification at any point, we're welcome to take questions, just so long as there are questions, and not something else. So please come up to the front, to this microphone, please. And there's one in the back.
There's a question behind you.
Yeah, I have a question to Professor Sandel. It might be something I didn't quite...
Do you identify yourself, Christian?
Oh, yeah. My name is Christian Roscoe. I teach at the University of Arizona. And, well, my question is one, maybe a clarification, but one of your arguments was that we should bring in moral arguments in the public debate because it's impossible to be neutral in certain issues. Well, it wasn't quite, and I think I agree with you that we need to have a vigorous debate that includes moral and religious issues. What wasn't quite clear to me regarding those issues, regarding when a fetus is a person or when regarding the examples of stem cell research, really how we are going to talk about this, how we are going to come to some kind of solution in those very difficult issues. If we have different religious standpoint or secular standpoint regarding that issue, I mean, I can see that we should bring in these issues. I think that those you're criticizing, I suppose, liberal, neutralist, and so on, believe that, I mean, this is not that we should transcend moral arguments, right, but that neutrality is a moral principle too, right? We should avoid conceptions of the good in order to move on to some kind of other stage. But you seem, I believe you reject that distinction to some degree in liberal political theory. But it wasn't quite clear in your talk, or at least, or maybe I just didn't get it, how you actually can go about talking about these issues and actually come to some kind of agreement, which I suppose is the end of public debate, not just stating the differences.
That's a great question and a difficult one. First, I would say that I wouldn't quite agree with the last thing you said, that the end of public debate is to come to agreement. In a democratic society teeming with disagreement, I think all we can aim at is to enrich the argument, not to assume that on these very contentious issues, by doing so we can get everyone to agree. Disagreements will fall away. Everyone will be persuaded as if there's some rational calculus that everyone will eventually crank through with enough argument and achieve consensus. So I don't think, and here Professor Rashkover talked about clamor and discord, not consensus, as the expression of this kind of moral engagement. So I don't think we can agree. But I take your general point, which is certainly a fair question and an important one. How at least can this proceed? How can we make some headway? How can we do more than just talk past one another? And here, let me just give an example drawn from the stem cell debate. And this is just drawn from a really very small and maybe not representative illustration. An experience I had serving on the President's Council of Bioethics, which I did for the past 4 years. And this is a group that by and large is conservative, and including a fair number of religious conservatives, though not exclusively. There are medical people from the sciences, from law, from public policy, from philosophy, from theology, and so on. I had never, before participating, becoming a member, I hadn't thought or known much at all about cloning or stem cell research. But as we went through, and this is a group of 18 people, we found ourselves engaged in precisely the argument about what is the moral status of the blastocyst, or the early embryo that I was talking about. And there were those among my colleagues who held the very strong view that the blastocyst was a full human person, because there was no clear line which you could point to in the development. When it suddenly became a human being, it was already genetically a human being. That was the argument. Now, how even to think about this? Never mind trying to win an argument, but explore an argument. And so it occurred to me to take seriously the picture, the moral picture, that he and those who agreed with him had. And I asked him a couple of questions. And the first question was, would you say that extracting stem cells from a 7-day blastocyst is as morally abhorrent as extracting organs from a 7-year-old? And he, principled and consistent with his position, said yes. Now, that answer, playing out the moral logic of the position, I think surprised a number of people, not the people who antecedently held his views strongly, but people like me who were trying to sort this out. Is that the view that I'm committed to if I accept this picture?
mind cloning or stem cells. In natural pregnancy, over half of all fertilized eggs fail to implant or are otherwise lost. If you took seriously the moral picture and got inside, you would have to conclude that this is a rampant epidemic of infant mortality, morally equivalent. And if we believe that, suppose there over half of all babies born die. That would be a massive public health challenge. And it would be the greatest epidemic of public health that we would try to fix. Well, do we do that? Are you committed to doing that in the case of those natural losses in the course of natural pregnancy? That's the second way. And here's the third, and there are others. Working from within. And this is a classic philosopher's puzzle, but taking seriously that argument. If you hold that view, suppose there were a fire in a fertility clinic, and you had time to save either a tray of a dozen embryos or a 6-year-old girl. Would it be wrong to save the girl? So there are ways of taking seriously. Now, these questions were not to ridicule the position, but to work within it and to see whether or one other. What about burial rights for lost embryos? Not miscarriages, fetuses, but lost embryos. Why don't, and this is a theological question, I'm not sure the answer, why don't those religious traditions that have that view require the same burial rights for lost embryos that they do for children who die after birth? So these are ways. Now, will this persuade everyone? No. Will it persuade those who hold certain views with deep conviction? Not necessarily. But it is a way of engaging and taking seriously and actually engaging in a kind of discourse that may persuade people who are trying to figure it out. So I offer that as one example, as a way of saying that simply because there is a hard moral or religious claim doesn't mean that it's unarguable.
Up front.
My name is Ellis West, and I teach in the political science department here. I do have a question, but I want to make a statement first. The problem that I have with your presentation is that you lump morality and religion together. And I know we don't have time to go into some of the distinctions, turn this into a seminar, but it seems to me that one could make the argument that one ought to distinguish between morality and religion, especially on the question of whether or not one can be neutral. I think, certainly, I have absolutely no problems with your position with respect to morality. It is no way to be neutral, and moreover, it's desirable that we have as many moral arguments as possible. But when it comes to religion, do you want to take that same position? And I would just, remind you, and something you're perfectly aware of, that in the course of Western political theory, you have people like St. Thomas, although without Christian, nevertheless, arguing that public policy issues could be settled on the basis of natural law or reason, which was available to all humans, whether they were Christians or not. And Roger Williams on the Protestant side took exactly the same position. So I'm just wondering, don't you have to at least concede that religious arguments and moral arguments ought to be treated somewhat differently or analyzed somewhat differently in your position?
Yes and no. Are there any other questions? Yes, in the sense that in impossible to reason about religion. That's one possible difference. No, in the sense that from the standpoint of the classical liberal worry about imposing on some values they don't share, worry about coercion or value imposition, that worry applies equally to embodying morality in law as to embodying religion in law. If you're worried about value imposition and coercion, then I think they're in the same basket. And the one other way in which I would argue against separating for this purpose is, wouldn't you agree that in at least some of the examples I mentioned, the abortion debate, this embryonic stem cell debate, at least, if a certain religious tradition is right about the moral status of the embryo or the fetus, that does have a bearing on what the public policy of law should be. And if that's right, then at least in some cases, we can't avoid religion any more than we can avoid morality. Those would be my answers.
Please identify yourself, if you'd like.
I'm Martin Kafka. I teach at Florida State, so we've gone all over the country, Arizona, Florida, in Richmond. Just to put a spin on the last question, it seems that one of the things that happens when you talk about these issues in terms of religious argumentation is that the types of questions about which we can't be neutral expands. So it's not just, is a blastocyst a human life anymore, but it's also, we open the door to questions like, was Jesus the Messiah? Or were Moses and Muhammad prophets? Or even how many gods are there, if any? These are also questions about which we can't be neutral. So are these kinds of questions part of the debate that you envision as well? Or is there something that sets these, which are even more explosive than what a blastocyst is? Is there a reason why we don't have to talk about that in public?
Well, I don't know. What I would invite you to offer would be an example of a question of public policy or law that, as in my example with the blastocyst, requires us to decide those questions. I don't rule it out in principle, but in order to know whether we would need to, what would be an example? What would be an example?
Well, I just think that if a religious tradition is right about what a blastocyst is, if the fact that it's a religious argument is essential to its being right, then those are the types of questions that we need to talk about. If it's not essential to its being right, then we don't need to talk about it as a religious issue at all.
Right. It may not be essential to its being right that it be endorsed from a certain religious view, which is precisely why we can investigate in these other ways, in the ways that we putting these counterexamples, pressing with analogies and seeing where the moral logic leads. So that way of pressing the view doesn't force us back to these questions about the prophets and so on. So I don't want to say that this would never be relevant, but for most of the kinds of things we debate, they probably are relevant. But still, I'd be willing to grapple with them if there were cases. Well, maybe an example of the kind of thing you have in mind would be disputes over territory, on the Temple Mount, that type of thing, where these, in order to resolve the claims of legitimacy, we would have to get into that. And I guess that's the only kind of example I can think of. There may be one.
Hi, my name is Mark White. I'm a student at the University of Richmond. Question for you is for the entire panel. Related to the issue of tolerance, and with morality and religion being brought out into the public sphere, religious views and principles are often classified as being somewhat contractual, as being based in So let's say the final decision is made with considerations of all morality and religious debate and everything else on Glasses' issue, for example. And one side comes out as losing. Simply because they lost the public debate doesn't mean that they have lost the private debate. They can still say, I still believe this. I don't care what the public says. You're wrong. This still is a human life, or something like that. What sort of rights do they then have? Do they maintain the right to continue to object, or are they subject to extreme social pressure more so than they are already necessarily? Do we have to hate the haters, so to speak, or be intolerant of being intolerant? Or are we supposed to accept this, especially since we've gone over this now in this scenario public and in the state of morale?
I can speak to that, and I actually want to remark a little bit on some of the comments that have been made already. But I think with respect to your immediate question, once certain issues have gone through the mechanics of public discourse, do religious believers reserve the right to behave in ways that are thereby different or actually illegal? And the fact of the matter is that religious believers have to understand that when they're living in this society, it's really a question of the law. So the question is not whether or not religious believers are legally entitled to continue to behave in ways that are antithetical to the law. The question is whether or not they are permitted to actually use their own reasonings as part of their participation in discussion about what constitutes the right law. To the extent that they then are permitted to use their religious justifications as part of that conversation, they are participating in a legal society, and they're going to have to be responsible for the laws that they have helped to formulate. So I mean, it's a misnomer to think that just because they think that they can participate in the conversation, they think that they're somehow they're not bound by the terms of the law that have been discerned.
But they can go on believing what
But they can, absolutely. No, they can absolutely go on to believe what they believe, and that's the given. I just want to make a philosophical remark, and I want to do it in appreciation of Professor Sandel's paradigms of stem cell research and so forth. The presupposition in Professor Sandel's approach actually is that, and it's interesting because the way that you present it almost makes it seem that your rationality is always, the purpose of it is always to call into question the religious believer's perspective. But there's an enormous amount of appreciation that your process is actually performing. The appreciation that your process is performing is you recognize that the believer actually comes from a certain worldview, and within that worldview there are terms of rationality. I mean, and many of us no longer live in the world where we think that there are single standards of rationality. We do live in a post-Wittgensteinian world where we understand that rationalities are local in some sense. And so what Professor Sandel's view honors is that religious rationality is there. It's not just with respect to moral issues, it's with respect to theological issues as well. So to the extent that the secularist wants to engage the believer, the secularist is inviting the believer to be as careful as she can be in trying to communicate the rational standards of her position. There'll be translatability between the worldviews. Translatability is not the same as saying that there are universal principles of rationality, but there will be translatability, and so there will be a possibility for even the religious believer to then respond to Professor, if the believer's done a good enough job of articulating her standards of rationality, such that Professor Sandel can ask responsible questions in her context, then she's also going to probably be able to be in a position to respond rationally and to continue to articulate the moral logic of her position so that a conversation is then possible. That's a moral conversation, it's a rational conversation, and it can be sometimes even about questions of fundamental religious beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily have to be one that's premised on universal standards